Water. In California, that simple word can conjure up strong emotions. Just bring up the words Delta smelt and you're sure to get a reaction. To some, the rapid decline of the Delta smelt is the canary in the coal mine, signaling the ecological problems in the Delta. To others, it's a prime example of overvaluing fish and undervaluing people. The Delta smelt live in the confluence of the state's two largest rivers, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Rivers. An area that spans almost 750,000 acres, has over 1,100 miles of levees, and supplies water to over 25 million Californians, as well as the state's $27 billion agriculture industry. Over the decades, the demands of providing a reliable supply of water from the Delta have often clashed with the need to protect the Delta's ecosystem. The Delta Stewardship Council, charged with overseeing the Delta, has established a Delta Plan by which every project impacting the Delta is to be judged. The most recent proposal up for consideration is the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, put forward by Governor Brown and supported by major water users, that includes rerouting some of the water around the Delta using two massive pipes. Will the Bay Delta Conservation Plan achieve the state's elusive goals for the Delta, providing a reliable, sufficient source of water to the state in a way that doesn't damage the Delta's ecosystem? The Delta, fixing California's water faucet.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. In 2009, the California legislature created the Delta Stewardship Council, whose mission is to achieve the co-equal goals of, quote, promoting a more reliable water supply and protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem. Our guest is Phil Isenberg, chair of the Delta Stewardship Council. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you very much.
So what is the Council's specific power and authority?
Council's directed to implement state law, establishing the co-equal goals as you indicated. State law is applicable to all agencies, not simply to us. So in some very important way, the relevance of making environmental issues in the Delta co-equal to a reliable water supply is a pretty dramatic change in state policy.
So who's on the council?
7 members, 4 appointed by the governor, 1 each by the legislature, 1 is a representative of the local Delta interest.
So you've got, this is a very technical, scientific situation we're dealing with the Delta. How do you make sure that you're getting good information to make good decisions?
Well, you rely on independent science as opposed to advocacy-based science. We have a cadre of people who follow our actions and testify at every meeting we have.
You do.
And it's about the same 250 groups, organizations, and individuals who testified in the first month we were there that have continued all the way through. And they represent largely water districts throughout California. They represent environmental organizations and interest, and then state and federal agencies who are also players in the water puzzle.
Do you have technical staff that supports the board?
Small staff, 55 people. We inherited the activity of something called CalFed Bay Delta, which went out of business when we were created. We got all their staff and all their duties. So it's pretty small operation, all things considered.
So we're talking about the Delta. The question is, what is the Delta's role in California's water history, and why is the Delta so important to California?
Well, it's the last place through which new supplies of water were taken starting in the 1950s and moved someplace else. The Delta is actually, the water from the Delta is a relatively small portion of all the water that's used in California on an annual basis. Less than 15% of all the water used for all purposes in the state come through the Delta, human purposes. But on the other hand, it is a key linchpin to what we call a state water project, which really isn't. It's a mix of local districts and a little bit of the state and a tiny bit of federal government. It's a key ingredient in the complicated way of taking water from one area, moving it around the state.
Now, I was under the impression, though, that they say the water's in the north, but the needs are in the south, if the farmers in the San Joaquin Valley or in Los Angeles. And it seems to be the implication that there's a lot more than 15% is being taken out of the Delta, or servicing the state of California, that's a primary source of water for the state.
Well, it is a primary source, but it's not the total source. For example, down in the valley, you'll have years where somewhere between 20 and as much as 60% of all the water you use come from underground water supplies. And that's not immediately transported from the Delta. So The reality is we get a lot of water that comes in. Much of it comes in precipitation, rain and snow. That's of all the moisture that comes into the state, that's where it comes from. Most of it is in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which is Northern California, but not exclusively. And so the complication figure is the mountains drain historically into and through the delta, out the San Francisco Bay, into the ocean. Human beings started to alter it 160 years ago, and we now move a slug of water through the delta and move it somewhere else.
What are the major challenges to the delta?
The ecosystem has been radically destroyed by human activity. First of all, the conversion of wetlands and tidal marshlands into farms and cities that happened from 1860, on up to today. Secondly, by taking what used to be a complicated array of rivers and streams going through the delta and straightening them, lining them, making them more regular. And the third is we started to use water as if there was no end to the amount that was available, and the environment began to drop off radically. Add them all together, you have the problems of the delta.
I want to ask one last question in this segment. That is, you mentioned CalFed. How is the Delta Stewardship Council different than CalFed, briefly?
Well, we have some regulatory authority to begin with, and CalFed never did. It was purely advisory. Our regulatory authority covers what the statutes call covered actions, things that are done by a federal or state agency that occur in whole or in part within the delta or the Suisun Marsh, and then things which affect our larger mandate of statewide water conservation and so on. And agencies are required to be consistent with the Delta Plan, and for covered actions, we have a review authority on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Up next, we'll talk about what the Council has done and will be doing to make sure the Delta is a reliable source of water for California, but in a way that is environmentally sustainable for the Delta. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Phil Isenberg, Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council. So what has the Council done so far, and specifically, what is the Delta Plan?
Delta Plan will be adopted by the Council this year, go into effect as soon as the final checkoff is received from a state agency in the normal process of affairs. The Delta Plan does a bunch of things, but basically it promotes the co-equal goals. And secondly, what the legislation says, it is the policy of the state of California to decrease reliance on the Delta for the future water supply of California. Now that's state law, that's not a suggestion.
Was there a number attached to that? I thought I saw 20%
no,
reduction.
That's a conservation standard.
Okay.
At the same time the law that we're involved in got passed, other bills were passed, including a 20% savings by the year 2020.
In overall water? In the
statewide.
Statewide.
Urban
okay.
water use.
Okay.
Agriculture is more discretionary because we don't really regulate water, agricultural water on a state basis the way we do urban water.
And we were talking off camera between the two segments, and you were mentioning that the water that comes out of the Delta, most of it goes to Valley Farms.
Yes.
And what percentage of that again?
About 80%.
And the large percentage, I think you said 15% goes to Los Angeles?
15% is across the Tehachapis to Southern California. The balance is Bay Area in Delta water users and a small number of water districts up north.
Okay, I think that's an interesting statistic I think that most people may not know. What are the major milestones moving forward in developing the Delta Plan?
Well, we've spent now 2 years doing this, endless hearings, 100 days worth of meetings. It's very complicated.
And you've been in state government for many years, so when you
Long
say
time.
endless hearings, you really mean it.
Yeah, this is government by exhaustion, and it is a true application of that principle. But basically, Californians want somebody else to change. They don't want to change themselves. And with water users on all sides and environmental interests on all sides, everybody's very interested in somebody else changing. And our job is to try to balance out the equations. Now the complication is that people tend to say, well, I want guarantees on what an environment would look like. You've got to guarantee 9 million coho salmon every year past this point or not. Well, science can't guarantee it. We wouldn't know how to do it anyway. Or water users say, wait a minute, I signed a contract for this amount of water, and even though I've never gotten it, that's a legal guarantee, and even if there's a drought, I get it. No, that's not true.
I'm hearing that from, frankly, the farmers.
We hear it from everybody in the state of California. It's not just farmers, but it is fundamentally wrong to say that government is supposed to somehow guarantee an unlimited supply of water each and every year to each and every interest throughout the state of California, because it cannot be done. Now, we're fortunate because we have a relatively abundant supply of water, not where all the people or all the farms are, but relatively abundant. But the system we've set up to ship that water has done severe damage to the Delta environment. Laws now require that damage be corrected. It is inevitably going to force people to be more efficient and use less water to do what they're doing today. This is not a case of building things so you can get endless amounts of new water at a cheap price.
Well, what is the council's role in projects covered under the Delta Plan?
Well, we serve as an appellate body when the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the governor's tunnel or conveyance facility in the Delta, if it's ever completed, we have kind of the last look at it in a very narrow way at the Delta Stewardship Council. In addition, the law said for covered actions by state or local agencies, as it meets the test of law, they can get to the council for review, and the council might make a determination it's inconsistent with the Delta Plan.
Are you limited by the legal boundaries of the Delta?
Yes and no. Statutory Delta was established in the 1950s. Added to that in our jurisdiction is the Suisun Marsh, which is part of the estuary system. So roughly about 900,000 acres of land. But the way the law has been written on covered actions, if an action touches the Delta or occurs in whole or in part within the Delta, it might be a covered action. So for example, the shipping of water to the Delta, through the Delta, out of the Delta, very clearly a covered action. Most water users do not like that.
Okay, let's talk about how the Delta Plan relates to other efforts, such as the one we just mentioned, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. It's very confusing because they keep using the word Delta, they keep using the word plan.
Right.
The way I think I hear you saying this is the Delta Plan is the kind of like the general plan for the Delta, and then something like the Bay Delta Conservation Plan really is a project, a proposal.
That's right. It's complicated because people like you and me, lawyers, have made a process that only we can understand.
I'm not taking any responsibility for
this.
this.
You are. Yes, you are. The Bay Delta Conservation Plan is the planning process that's been underway for a very long time, but revitalized by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006 to upgrade the current Delta export facility. Most people seem to think there's nothing there now. We've been exporting water from the Delta since the mid-1950s with a combination of federal and state pumps and canals and so on and so forth. But it's an old creaky system. It's doing severe damage to fish species in particular, and it's bound to be improved at one time or another. The current proposal is to probably build 2 parallel tunnels underneath the Delta. But the fight is really about water. How much do I get? Why do I have to give up my water so he can have his water? You know, the old historic fight.
It's always been going on, hasn't it? Well,
right.
I want to thank Phil Isenberg, chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, for joining us. Up next, we'll talk about one of those proposals for the Delta, the governor's Bay Delta Conservation Plan. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Governor Brown is not new to California's water wars. In 1982, he unsuccessfully pushed for a peripheral canal to move water from the Delta, relied on by valley farmers and almost 2/3 of all Californians. Will the governor's latest attempt to resolve California's water wars have a different result this time? Our guest is Dale Hoffman-Floerke, Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Water Resources, here to explain the governor's latest proposal. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's start with that. What is the governor proposing?
Well, first of all, I'd really like to kind of move away from the characterization of the activity that we're doing, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, as a continuation of the water wars. We've been working on trying to come up with a proposal that we believe will meet all the needs of the state of California and the regulatory agencies. We've been doing this for over 7 years. So I really want to get away from this characterization. We'd like to think that it's a more collaborative approach than what was taking place a few years ago, actually back in the 80s. And we're really looking at something quite a bit differently, which I'll talk about maybe in a little later. For your readers, the Delta serves as a water supply to over 25 million people and hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural land in the San Joaquin Valley and other areas. We serve Silicon Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, and then of course Southern California. It's a really important place also for fish and animals in the Delta. It's an extremely critical area where fish migrate through and spend some of their life cycle within the Delta. And so
the famous Delta smelt.
The Delta smelt is one of those really important species. A number of species either go through the Delta or spend their entire lifetime, like the Delta smelt in the Delta.
Well, what is the timeline for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan?
The timeline right now is, as I mentioned, we've been working on it for a number of years, working very closely with the federal agencies and local agencies as well. We are about ready to release the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. That's the planning document. That's part of Section 10 under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We will be releasing parts of the document in the next few weeks, and over the course of March and April we'll complete the release of that. That will be loaded up on our website. Concurrent with that, we're in the process of, we've completed a draft environmental impact report, impact statement, to meet our CEQA and NEPA needs for ensuring that the federal and state agencies were meeting our Section 10 requirements of the Federal Endangered Species Act and the Natural Community Conservation Act, which is a state act for incidental take permit.
Well, let me ask you about this. The water being pumped under the governor's plan, how is that going to differ from the water being pumped or allowed to be pumped under the current arrangement?
Well, actually, it's really not that much different, except that it includes facilities that would be located in the northern part of the Delta, just south of Sacramento. We'll be relying on facilities that will be built about 3 intakes along the Sacramento River, and it will have tunnels, 2 twin tunnels that'll be about 35 miles long that will meet at the existing facilities on the south end of the Delta.
So right now the pumps are at the south end of the Delta.
Correct.
And what you're going to do is put 2 or 3 pumps at the north end of the Delta,
correct,
ship it around, and then connect down to those southern pumps?
Ship it underneath.
Underneath, I'm sorry.
Yeah, these are tunnels, right.
Tunnels, underneath, and get it to those south pumps.
Exactly.
That assumes that then the south pumps will be taking less water out.
During certain times of the year, the South Delta pumps will not be used at all or be used very little. There will be other times in the year when the flows are low on the Sacramento River where we may need to rely more on the South Delta pumps. So we won't be taking them offline altogether, but they'll be used differently.
But the total amount of water that would be coming out of the Delta, how would it differ from the current situation?
It really wouldn't differ. We would be dealing with the same different scenarios dependent on different water year types, and it would really be about the same amount of water that's currently being sent or exported south at the south pumps.
Well, here's the multi-billion-dollar question.
Okay.
How much does it cost, and who's going to pay for it?
Okay. Well, the total cost for the conveyance, for the capital cost, is about $19.9 billion. And when you include the cost of the restoration activities as far as capital and the mitigation activities, the mitigation lands of about 30,000 acres up front. Now, let me back up. The entire facility includes about 100,000 acres of habitat. So it includes the conveyance facilities and includes the restoration component as well. So the total cost overall is about $24.7 million. And of that, the water contractors, the state and federal water contractors, the water users will be expected to pay a little over $16 million. And then the remaining would be split by the state and federal governments. Okay,
we've only got about 20 seconds left in this segment, but I did want to ask you about reliability and whether or not the water is going to be guaranteed.
Okay. There's no guarantee that we'll be able to pump X number amount of acre feet. What we are going to get out of this is that we will have reliability as long as we meet all of the rules and regulations that are set forth in the permits, the BDC permits that will be issued by the state and federal government. Once we meet those conditions, we expect to be able to have water supply reliability by being able to pump when we need to.
Okay, we're going to talk about the massive tunnels that the governor's proposing at a cost of $14 billion or so. Is that the most cost-effective solution for the Delta water issue? Some critics say no, and we'll give our guests an opportunity to answer some of those charges in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. While the state's biggest urban water users and rural irrigation districts support the governor's proposal, farmers in the Delta and some environmentalists strongly oppose it. They argue that there are more cost-effective and environmentally sound ways to address the Delta problem. We're talking with Dale Hoffman-Floerke, the Chief Deputy Director of the California Department of Water Resources and Administrative Spokesperson. So, some assert that if the new facility is built, there's going to be an incentive to weaken environmental laws to allow maximum pumping for water supply purposes. How do you respond to that?
Well, in a word, that absolutely won't happen. We have been working very closely with the federal and state regulatory agencies, and we are at the table constantly trying to come up with environmental protections and criteria that we would employ and embody into the BDCP that they would then write their permits. So I don't believe that there would be any reason to weaken them when we worked so hard with them to come up with a way to actually make this happen.
You know, critics also say, listen, you can do levee repairs, you can do water storage, you can do improved conservation and recycling. I think they call it a portfolio approach. Sure. That's a more efficient, cost-effective way, environmentally sound way to address California's water needs. And they also note that the upgrade of the levees would cost about $2 to $4 billion versus, you know, the $14 billion plus for the tunnels project. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the cost of improving levees, all of the levees necessary to move water in a manner down toward the south end of the delta, would be cost prohibitive. It's hugely expensive, and we really don't have that kind of money to do that for all of the levees that would be necessary, and it really wouldn't protect us against a catastrophic event in the south end of the delta, where we would end up not being able to do any pumping at all. In addition to that, the portfolio evaluation, or their proposed project, has a number of activities like desalination and water conservation. There's been no identification of how those would get paid for in this whole process. So we haven't got that information, and although we are evaluating some components of that, the 3,000 CFS proposed.
CFS, you better describe that for our viewers.
Okay. 3,000 CFS, cubic feet per second.
Okay.
That's their proposal.
And the governor's proposal, I think, is 9,000?
We are proposing a 9,000 CFS double tunnel facility. Exactly.
And that's combined, that the two tunnels would be a total of 9,000?
That's exactly right.
And so some of the environmentalists and some of the people up in the Delta say, no, we should do 3,000.
Right.
And you're saying that wouldn't solve the problem?
Well, it wouldn't for a couple of reasons I just described. It also wouldn't address the reverse flow problems in the south end of the Delta, whereby we are having issues with entraining fish like Delta smelt and some salmon species.
Can you briefly explain that situation, that problem?
Sure. When the Delta is subject to tidal effect, and when we are pumping water on the south end of the Delta, the pumps are really large, and they take water, I guess, suction, if you will. The flow ends up going in a reverse flow.
It changes the flow.
It changes the flow from the normal, natural direction that it would normally flow.
And the smelt, of course, go with the flow.
The smelt and salmon frequently go with the flow. It depends on a lot of different factors, but that is an issue that we've been concerned about for many years. That's one of the reasons why we're proposing to move the pumps to the northern part of the Delta, where you would not be subject to, the fish wouldn't be subject to these reverse flows at the current south pumps.
Okay, you could make, what about the argument that some make that, listen, why don't we try 3,000 cubic feet per second of water, and then if that doesn't work, we can always modify it and make it bigger.
Okay. One of the big issues that we have, big concern with that, is that if we only built a facility that was 3,000 CFS, in the event of a catastrophic event, like a very large earthquake that basically put the facilities out of commission, there'd be no way to get enough water and reliability of water down to Southern California, both for in the San Joaquin Valley and Silicon Valley for farms and municipal use.
One last question, we've only got about 30 seconds left, and that is, what are you going to do to make sure you address the legitimate concerns of Delta counties, communities, and agriculture?
We've been meeting regularly with all of the Delta interests, local government and others, and listening to their concerns, what issues that they have, and we are required in our CEQA and NEPA documentation to address environmental impacts and mitigate for those. We'll be putting a document out on the street for the public to review. If they still have concerns about the way we've mitigated for an effect, they can always send us a letter, meet with us, and we'll be able to make some adjustments.
And this has been a long, ongoing process. And it's going to continue. Well, I'm going to thank Dale Hoffman-Floerke from the California Department of Water Resources, as well as Phil Isenberg from the Delta Stewardship Council for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
My name is Sarge Green, and I am a water scientist with the California Water Institute at Fresno State. California today faces unacceptable risks from flooding, unreliable water supplies, and habitat and species declines. The stakes are tremendously high, and every Californian has an interest. The greatest challenge is the condition of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is located between Stockton and Sacramento. The Delta is the switching yard for floodwater, water supplies for over 28 million Californians, and successful fish populations. California must make strategic investments in the Delta to stave off economic and environmental disaster. It is difficult to imagine such investments when so many Californians are still stressed by the recent economic times, but we will have no economy without water. With sound investments, flood damages will be averted, water supplies will be reliable, and ecosystems will be improved. Delta levees, channels, and habitats need near-term investment. Long-term investments, such as bypass tunnels around the Delta, need final design and implementation. All Californians need to protect our water future. The days of any region isolating itself from the others are over. We are all interdependent. This is Sarge Green for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.